Welcome everyone at FILMFEST Hamburg. My name is Dana Linsen. I'm a film critic from the Netherlands, and I'll be speaking with filmmaker Kelly Reichardt, who is one of the filmmakers in Fokus in the contemporary cinema program. I'm here in Hamburg, even though I came by train, and Kelly is all the way in Portland, Oregon. Kelly, welcome. It's so great to have you here. Actually, we've talked before, but we've never talked face-to-face, and also we've never talked with visuals. And then when I was doing all my preparations and I was reading, I read that when you were preparing for First Cow, you actually met your your two actors also only through Skype, and you saw them in person the first day of shooting on set. What is it like to meet a person through video calling? Can you really meet them?
Well, I'm teaching now on video because my class is in New York and I'm in Portland. So yeah, you can get a sense of someone. I mean, I think when I worked with Michelle Williams, I only spoke to her on the phone and wrote her before meeting her. But there was more to look at of her. But with John and we Skyped quite often, and Orion sent several readings, and you know, we worked with what we had because Orion was actually in London, and so, but still, it's different when you are face to face, of course. Yeah.
I'm also asking this question because you are in Portland, which is a place that is really important for your work and special for us as an audience to get to know your body of work and your interest in time and landscape. But Portland and Oregon especially are also the theater of both bushfires. So I assume the sky is orange all day, and at the same time, Portland also has been the epicenter of violent confrontations between right-wing agitators and peaceful protesters for the Black Lives Matter movement that came to surface again recently. So how is it for you to be there now in these quite extraordinary circumstances?
Yeah, the fires feel like the end of the world, really. It's okay right now, it's hazy, but the last 2 nights have been quite bad. California, of course, is much worse, but really the whole West is on fire. It's not even just the coast, Idaho, Arizona, and it seems much like this whole thing we have here, this ridiculous thing we have here in the States where people won't wear masks, and the constant denial of the virus. It really is discouraging as far as, I mean, the most basic thing of wearing a mask during a pandemic. It makes you think, how will we ever get hold of climate change? Because we can't even get these most basic, just most basic behaviors changed. So yeah, it's really frightening time and strange time, but also, you know, the protests for a while, the marches were really, do feel powerful and moving. And now, I don't know, yeah, there's more of there's more anarchy, and I can't tell really what the right thing is. It's really hard to know if, I don't know, it's just so hard to know where things are headed in the United States. It's very stressful living situation for everybody, but California was 120 degrees this week. So
I think it's good for us in Europe also to understand what's going on. We get bits and snippets through the news, of course, but we'll never grasp the full tragedy.
I mean, just to say what you see on the news is quite interesting for Portland, because the late night, the marches have gone throughout the city, all over the city, and go on all the time. But the violent part is really a 3-block area. Like if you came to Portland, you would never know what was going on unless you specifically went downtown to this area. So it's just interesting that the news a little bit makes it seem like if you walk out the door, you're going to get clunked on the head, which isn't really the case.
Still, I wanted to connect actually this very actual, urgent and present day situation a little bit to your work, because I think the first thing people think about when they familiarize themselves with your work is the minimalism and the relation between landscape and time, and I really hope that we get to talk about that a little bit as well. But I was thinking you could also talk about your work in terms of genre. And First Cow, the film that will premiere here at Hamburg Film Fest, that will show alongside Meek's Cutoff and River of Grass, your first film. But especially the Meek's Cutoff and First Cow can be seen as these alternative westerns. And as we all know, the westerns have been very instrumental in creating these stereotypes of, well, white masculinity, while at the other hand they also deal with othering of Native Americans or immigrants, the Chinese immigrant in First Cow or the Native American in Meek's Cutoff. You could say that Night Moves, your film that deals with eco-activism, is a thriller, but it also relates very much to what's happening in the world right now. So it could give us another take on some of the themes that you're working with. Do these present-day situations actually give you a new insight on your work? Is that something that you're revisiting the way that we as an audience are going to revisit it now?
No, I'm never really looking back, I have to say. You know, when you finish a film, you're kind of ready to not be thinking about it anymore. It actually, yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought about it, except for that I need to talk about the film. And I'm not the most articulate person talking about, Jonathan Raymond, the writer, is much more articulate about these things. I'm more of a visual person. But I mean, I think the moment that we're in now, I wouldn't really try to respond to it in something I was making right now. Like there's not enough distance from it to understand it. It's a question in what you're doing moving forward. There are a lot of questions, but I mean, honestly, it's funny how, as you're saying it, how romanticized the West is in American culture, but currently you feel like the rest of the country has no real interest in the fact that it's burning. It doesn't feel like a real topic of conversation or of interest. It feels a little bit like when you read about the Dust Bowl years in the middle of the country, how the East Coast was kind of oblivious to it. It doesn't, for all the attention and the mythology of the West, people seem quite fine to let it disappear. But I don't know, it's a really strange, it's hard to talk, the country's so divided right now. We're so in the middle of something. It makes it hard to, I'm sure some of the topics are all the same. Like in First Cow, obviously race is a big topic, as is class, and just the different power structures and how early they came into being, and just the behavior around them. Those are all there, but somehow it's easier to handle it in a bygone time than it is to get your arms around in the present moment, as far as art making goes, I think.
Yeah, I think we all know that maybe historical films are actually the best telescopes to the present, or the microscopes, to see what's really going on. You already mentioned your close collaboration with Jonathan Raymond, a writer and screenwriter and collaborator on many of your projects. And also you mentioned being more of a visual person. And I think this is a really good moment to pick up a little bit on the way you collaborate, and maybe talk in more detail about the two films that you worked on that will be screening here. I was just going to ask, are you a reader? Because you like to work with writers. And then I was thinking, like, okay, and when you're reading their stories or their books, how are you reading them? Do you get images right away, or what's happening in your mind's eye at those moments?
Yes, I sometimes it's a relief when I'm reading and I realize, like, this book can't be a film. It just won't work. It's all in the language, and then I could turn off that part of my brain. But I mean, Meek's Cutoff didn't exist as something else before we, there's different things, like some of John's writing, like with Old Joy, that was a piece of writing before I started. And actually the first thing I ever read from John was his first novel, The Half-Life, which is what First Cow is based on. And so that was many years ago. And so a lot of the times we're writing around, we're maybe out looking at art together, or we're out looking at locations, or just ideas of places he has. You mentioned Night Moods. That script came out of organic farm where John and his family spend a lot of time, and he was going down there and sort of eavesdropping on the local politics, and he brought me down there, and that script was born out of that. And Meek's Cutoff was from some camping trips we did with some painter friends that took us out through Eastern Oregon. And then John started researching that, he found the story of Stephen Meek and made a fictional, not an adaptation at all, it's a completely created story he made up. But there is the thread of history in it with the true Stephen Meek. So it's really been different for each film, our experience. I mean, we are very close friends. He lives up the street, and so we talk several times a day. So it's hard to say exactly what the process is at this point, because it's so interwoven with life. But it usually begins, even if it's an idea we've come up with together and we make an outline, it's always John that's writing the first pass, and that then there's something to work on and for me to fill out and add characters to, and through figuring out how I'd shoot each scene. I mean, he sort of does the first pass and I immediately take it apart and start building it and back up, and then it goes back and forth between us. But I think to know how to shoot something, you kind of have to take something really apart and rebuild it to understand just how you would visually tell the story, and just to understand it. Like I've never, even when I worked with Miley Malloy's stories, which were 3 stories from 2 sets of short films. I mean, every part of film, I think, is you're building things up and then you're deconstructing it again and taking it apart and rebuilding it. And that kind of goes on from script writing through editing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you mentioned editing because, of course, this taking apart not only happens like in the script stage several times, but then also when the shoot begins, but you're also self-editing your films. So is that another way to rediscover the film or give it its final form? What is editing for you?
I mean, in a way, you're always editing, because even like planning how things are going to be shot, you know, I'm building it up by myself, and then I'm meeting with Christopher Blauvelt, the cinematographer, and we immediately start breaking it down to what it is and rebuilding it, you know. So this building and unbuilding thing goes throughout, but editing is, you know, you have this very intense time where you're collaborating on making a film in pre-production and production, and it's wonderful when those collaborations are great. I mean, it's the best. And then in the editing room, it's like getting the film back to yourself again, and you're alone again with your thoughts and what you originally had in mind. And I just really like sort of going back and looking at, you know, building all the parts again and building it back up, and just being alone with it in a quiet place after all this activity of making it. And I think it's quite useful for thinking about, you become very intimately, absolutely aware of your mistakes or what could have been, and you can take this into your next bit of filmmaking, you know, and or also the thrill of when it works, or it works a new way, and or whatever that is. I just want to yeah, I mean, some of the films could be put together in different ways, and some of them are more like First Cow are more they're shot in ways where they would be like puzzle pieces coming together. But I mean, it began because I could never afford an editor. So that's how I started doing it. It was just, there was no, and then I just became attached to the process.
So when you say you can deal with your mistakes while editing and you bring something to every new project, can you give an example? I don't know if it's too early to say what you maybe learned from making First Cow, but maybe from Meek's Cutoff.
Well, it's really more of learning the way we shoot, which is often very fast and have to keep moving. It's maybe learning, starting to know, like, if you have to give something up, making sure you give the correct thing up, like in a shooting day, when something has to be knocked out of the schedule. I know how I put things together well enough to know what my priority list is. Or maybe it's just a way of keeping your eye open as much as everything's planned, that when you're in a space to be comfortable enough to throw your plan away if something else is presenting itself that might be better. At a younger age, I would be so locked into my plan. I would fight against any changes, which I don't do anymore. Now I'm older and I feel more open and just more. Christopher Blauvelt, who I shoot with, we're talking about editing every time we set up a shot. We're endlessly talking about editing on set and how things go together. And that's really fun conversation to be able to have with your cinematographer. So it's just kind of that it becomes a part of the language maybe earlier on. It's not a separate language like now editing. Editing is like in my mind while I'm shooting.
Especially, I think, in your case, when the shooting is very much, or maybe First Cow is maybe also a bit of a heist film, because there is a real plot, and a cow needs to be stolen, and a plot needs to be figured out and stuff like that. Meek's Cutoff in a way is more this minimalist, slow cinema, observational, contemplative kind of cinema where it's really very much about the actions that the characters are performing. You could even say to the extent that the characters don't exist outside of their actions. So filming that in a long take is probably also in a way editing in camera, or is that a connection that you could make?
Well, when I was making Meek's, it was interesting. There were definitely discoveries as we went along. Getting back to your first question about not being with actors until you're shooting. I mean, in the case of Meek's Cutoff, I was out in that desert for months and months before actors came, but I didn't have actors or oxen or wagons until, so if you're sitting out there with your viewfinder looking at nothing versus, oh, here's what's in the frame, you have a concept of, like, we had a concept that in writing, you know, Jonathan was writing from the point of view of the Emily character, Michelle Williams' character, but what did that really mean to me when I was out there? At the same time, time was running out because everything took much longer than, I had never worked oxen, and we were shooting in very remote places. So the time we got there, half the day was eaten up, half the shooting day. And but I was realizing during shooting these wide shots, it would have been like master shots, that that something good was going on in the distance from the lead actors, and I sort of saw while I was shooting my way into this thing of, okay, I only have time to do 4 close-ups, and I won't go down and shoot the men's close-ups. I'll shoot the listeners. So it became this thing of not following the dialogue in any way for where the response would be, but in fact going to the observers and the people that are not the focus in the script so much, for the closer shots. And that was more discovered. Like, I knew the concept I wanted, but I didn't know exactly how I was going to get it until I was shooting, which ended up including a lot of these single wide shots, much to the chagrin of the lead actors who are in the wide shots. So that was sort of a discovery, but still in the editing room, there were so many different ways that film could be put together. Cutting that film was maybe the hardest of all the films. It was really, and part of why it was so difficult is there were so few sounds to deal with, because it was probably the last time I'll ever make a film where there'd be true quiet, because now there's just so much air traffic. But it is, the soundscape of that film is so quiet that, you know, you're really seeing how, like when there's score or things like that, you're not really noticing the cut in films. You're taken along because of the sounds. And when you really minimalize that kind of, and you're having a really quiet film, the editing is much more, the viewer, whether they realize it or not, are much more in tune to when a cut happens and what shot you're in. And so it was really a challenging, film from every perspective.
I find it interesting that you basically saying that you discovered the film or the gaze, or maybe the reversal of the gaze of that film while shooting, and then maybe rediscovered it during the editing, because it's been such an important film for actually understanding the position of women during these times when settlers would travel across the United States to be and go west. I'm also interested when you say we have all these wide shots, how do you direct the actors? What do you tell them to do when they're going to be kind of visible and busy for such a long time?
Just to say, in the beginning, I thought that I would have the female gaze, but I thought I would also, I presumed that I would be sort of, that it would be mixed in with the being in the thick of these scenes that the men were in. And it was while shooting it that I realized I didn't need to get into that mix at all. And I'd be better off just completely, which was a very hard sell to give to some of the male actors.
No, like how do you direct your actors in such situations? Like what do you tell them to do or prepare with them even?
Well, they came for 2 weeks before we started shooting. I think it was 2 weeks, maybe. Oh, I can't remember how long before, but they had like a week of pioneer camp. And Dave Dornberg, who was the production designer, set up like a general store because they had different amounts of money, these three families. And so they really shopped for what would go on their wagon and these sorts of things. And they learned to make fire without matches, and they learned to cook bread in the ground and to put up the tent and take down the tent 1,000,000 times. And they had to be trained to steer the oxen, which are they're just wild bulls. You can't train an oxen. So it's why most Westerns just use horses, is because the oxen are quite dangerous, actually. But so there was a lot for them to learn. And so my approach with the actors is just that, especially in Meeks, like all the stuff they're doing is so dangerous, especially for the women. They have those bonnets on and they have no peripheral vision whatsoever. And it really closes off. They kept talking about how they couldn't hear anything because of the bonnets. So they have so much they have to physically do with animals and with building things and they're always busy doing. And so there's really it's just sort of what happens. People have tasks like that or things they have to keep responding to, like a bull that can kill you. It really kind of solves the what to do in the scene. It's to a large degree, and some of the choices are just really what's happening with the distance of sound and voices and being when you put actors into cowboy outfits, there is just a thing where people get big and they do it, just like you can't pull people back. It's interesting, like once that cowboy outfit's on. But if they're in a wide shot and you are lowering their voices, you can sort of de-emphasize things in other ways. And also just what the actors are bringing. I mean, I shot many extra rolls of Zoe Kazan and Paul Dano. They could have been their own movie. I mean,
is that still there, that material?
I don't know where it is, God, in some basement. But they just have a great rapport. Hilarious, like very funny. Both very physical actors, and I think quite a few of these actors were Shirley Henderson. I mean, just the people that there's some actors that really want the close-up to get across, and it's where they feel in their zone. And there's other actors that are quite into using their full bodies.
Kelly, how was that different for First Cow, where you also put people in cowboy costumes, but it seems you employed a different style, both in shooting. I'm not going to say there was more humor in it, because that would imply that your other films don't have humor, but there was definitely a lot of humor.
Yeah, there's more humor
in the film. And there is also a different pacing in that film. So you sort of you're in the same period of time, 20 years later, I think. You're working with a known arena in a sense, but you're making a different film. So how did that develop?
Well, some of the humor derives from John's book and came into the script. I mean, there's no cow in the book, so you know the book is spans 4 decades, and they go to China, and so this is we really had to find a pared down story so all of John's themes and these 2 great characters could come to life. But there was well, in the cowboy outfits, the guys that are in the real the trappers, I didn't try to hold them back at all. If anything, I just let them amp it up with each other, and that became humorous to me. Like I didn't really hold them back. And then King Lou and Cookie, you know, they're not really in cowboy gear. They're, you know, and they, those 2 actors, I don't know, they were just never not interesting to watch. And I mean, as soon as April Napier, who did the costumes, as soon as, it was pretty much like with everyone, they'd go through this time machine and come out of her wardrobe room in these outfits and look so much of the time. We had the up where we shot around the fort where the beaver pelts are being sold, where the sort of main part of town, you know, a lot of those actors were there for the week just in costume around the clock and just being in there. I mean, when you start to surround people with you know, they don't have their phones and they're in these clothes and they're out in this place and the props are sort of what being really used in, you know, on camera and off camera. People get into it. Also, there's just a functionality of things like how to actually set a trap, or they're busy also. John is cooking, or there's wasn't a lot of downtime in these periods. We're talking about 1820 or Meek's 1845. Like, people are busy all the time because there's always some amount of work that has to be done. And that's, to me, very useful for if you're concentrating on doing something. I think that John Magaro has a lot of Cookie in him, and I think that Orion has a lot of King Lou in him. And that is just luck that happened. Yeah, I mean, if Orion was left to his own devices, he always thought everything was being done in too small a way. Kelly, are you sure? You know, but he was very generous and trusting to go against his own instincts and do it the way I would ask him to. And he just had such I never tired of watching him in the edit room. There were no takes that weren't interesting to me. I found him always fascinating to watch, both of them, really. And not to mention getting to work with Toby Jones. And yeah, it was just a very nice cast, I have to say, to work with.
Do you feel that your approach to landscape in this film, which is a bit more plot-based, was different? Or your relation even to time, or the immersion in time and gesture?
In a case like Meek's Cutoff, you know, the desert is really one animal that's very different than the forest, where everything is super vertical, these trees. And I shot them both in the Academy frame, the square, and but First Cow is very intimate. We're really close in with these two. We're really hunkered down, and it's much more, I think of it as a very low to the ground film. I mean, Cookie is a forager, and there's a lot that's happening on the ground, including milking the cow. And of course, King Lou is up in his tree, and he's a sort of pie in the sky sort of thinker. And Cookie is a much more practical, down-to-earth person. So I think these things lead you to decide where the camera goes, because, but I guess I had this feeling, and I was watching films that were also, I was returning to the Apu trilogy, which is a very down to the ground kind of shooting style.
The Indian Satyajit Ray films, yes.
Yeah, and there was something about that approach all the time, that there was these like sort of dirt and earth floors and these hutches, and the traps, and just a lot of stuff would be happening low down. That's where Chris Blauvelt and I were with the camera, and that seemed really different than Meek's, or, you know, and we had a very sort of economical shooting strategy for King Lou and Cookie. And then when we were in the chief factor's house, we allowed ourselves to be more elaborate with the camera, and which was fun because, you know, just to express the differences of these two worlds.
The Apu trilogy is a very fascinating and remarkable reference. I don't think I would have thought of it. I asked you before if you're a reader. Are you a cinephile? I mean, how do you inspire yourself, maybe while making a film or before making a film? Do you actually watch a lot of films?
I've been teaching film for almost 25 years, so yeah. So there's a lot of, you know, I'll sometimes set the semester around the films I most want to think about, and you know, I'd been watching quite a bit of Japanese cinema at the time when I made First Cow. So it was, yeah, a lot of those films are also, you know, if you go to where people are sitting on the ground a lot, the camera ends up being low, and there's a really nice quality to that, and worked for their little small intimate world.
We have to end this conversation in a bit because you're actually teaching shortly. This would be the moment where I would feel like, oh, I've been asking way too many questions already. Let's ask the audience to ask their questions. Unfortunately, we cannot do that. But in my mind, there's always this young filmmaker in the audience, and since you're gonna be talking to some of them really soon, I'm not gonna ask you what the best advice is that you give young filmmakers, but what is actually the best question young filmmakers ask you?
I guess I just talk about process a lot, and I think teaching and filmmaking are similar in that way. You're never gonna conquer it. They're both like ongoing things that the more you learn and figure out, the more you feel you have to learn and figure out, and then, you know, the class changes, and then the film changes, and you're with a new group. But well, I emphasize that research is the most fun part of filmmaking, and it's what introduces you to life and new people that you wouldn't otherwise meet, and the answers are usually found, they're not the answers you're looking for, but they'll inform other things. And this is all to say that Google is not research. Research is something that happens, it's a type of research, but there's a lived research that happens, and looking at a location on a screen, you're not going to meet the person that owns the property who's going to end up telling you some story that gives you it is about something else completely, or on the way to the location, you're not going to witness something you wouldn't have otherwise seen. So there's a thing about getting out, and I guess that's my biggest thing with my students, is trying to get them off their screens and have a more lived experience. and just to focus that everything, part of it is a process, and you just keep breaking it down to the smallest bits, and hunker down into the small stuff.
Kelly, we can only hope and pray that we will be able to get off our screens really soon and
wouldn't that be wonderful?
Into the world, so that you can actually just walk around and encounter unexpected things that will lead you to answers to questions that you didn't even know you have. I wish I could sit in on your class with your students, but I think we have to wrap it up now.
No, I really want to thank you for showing the films. It's really, I'm very, we're all very happy that that you're going to be showing them, and I really appreciate the energy and care that and the audience for checking them out.
Kelly, thank you so much. Stay safe, and we hope to welcome you in Hamburg.
Take care, everybody.
Yes, peace.